What's up, guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Joannis or Joe Hatagwa. I'm a Sierra Leonean American living here in West Africa. And if you want to know where and how weed or cannabis is legal on the continent of Africa and understand the market size for investment and opportunity, then this is the video for you. All right, and if you're watching this now, you're either watching live or you're watching a replay. For those of you who are watching on Instagram, you can click on the link in my profile and that'll take you to watch the YouTube live. And those of you who are watching on YouTube live, give me a thumbs up so I know you can hear me. Manelik is here. What's up? Those of you who are watching on Instagram, you guys can click on the link in my profile and that'll take you to the live. All right, so today we are talking about cannabis in Africa. There's been a lot of questions over the last 2 years since I've been going live about cannabis in Africa and what the opportunity is here. Is it legal? Is it not legal? Where is it legal? And we're going to talk about all of that. We're also going to talk about the size of the market, whether that's the illicit use or the legal use of cannabis. We're going to talk about all of that today. I'm going to give you guys a chance to ask any questions, of course, along the way. And then, of course, add your 2 cents as we go along. There have been many people joining these lives throughout the last 2 years asking about cannabis. So I hope that you guys find this interesting and helpful if you want to know about the cannabis market on the continent of Africa. I know that it tends to be a bit taboo to talk about cannabis. And, you know, people have their differences of opinion as it pertains to cannabis. I am a cannabis advocate, and I lived in California for 4 years, right after it was recreationally legalized. Prior to that, it was already legalized medically. And so I've already been through that process of watching it become a little bit more normalized. I also lived in New York when they decriminalized cannabis. And then, of course, I recently visited New York when they made it legal once again. So with that, I'm going to get right into it. For those of you who are just joining on Instagram Live, you guys can go over to the profile. The link in my profile will take you to the live where I'm going to be presenting on screen. But before I do that, actually, no one's actually told me that you can hear me. Can you guys give me a thumbs up so I know you can hear me? If you're on Instagram, can you hear me? If you're on YouTube, can you hear me? Let me know that you guys can hear me. We're live on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter as well. So we are live on a number of different platforms, and we're live on Facebook too. Okay, can you guys hear me? Miss P's here. Hey, Miss P, how's it going? Okay, Menelik says you can hear me loud and clear. Good. Anne-Marie Harding's here. Miss P says you can hear me. Great. All right, cool. And again, if you're joining us on Instagram Live, just go to the link in my profile. That'll take you over to the YouTube Live so you can watch on screen as I present. Let me see how it looks. Oof. The way it comes up on screen is not looking too good. So I may have to remove it and not present it that way. That doesn't look too good. So we're gonna get into the presentation. I'll just do it the old-fashioned way of presenting, and then we'll just go from there. Okay, cool. So let's see. Let me just remove this from the studio. All right, cool. So again, my name is Joannis. Some people call me Joe Hatagwa. I am a Sierra Leonean American. I do live in West Africa. I'm back and forth between Ghana and Sierra Leone. And so cannabis is a topic of discussion amongst some friends of mine in both countries. And people back home in the US, or when I lived in the US, would always ask me about that. You know, as someone who's a cannabis advocate, they would always ask, you know, what are my plans for how I'm planning to discuss it and deal with it, consume cannabis on the continent of Africa. And we're going to talk about exactly what it means to be legal or illegal on the continent of Africa. So we're going to talk about it all. Africa Revenge is here. So no problem, brother. Take your time. Yeah, the presentation was a little bit off when you try to do it through this platform, through StreamYard. So I'm just going to do the regular way. So again, if you guys are joining on Instagram Live, just go to the profile link, the link in my profile, and that'll take you to the YouTube channel, and then you can just go to the live from there. Okay, so let's get right into it. We got Pro Woman J in here from Chicago. What's up? What's up? What's up? Before I get started, because there was a comment that came early in the day, as soon as I made it clear that today's topic was the cannabis industry on the continent of Africa. This person, Ben Bo, said this in particular. So you are promoting weeds, plural, in Africa. Is this your contribution in uplifting Africans? And so I guess he meant weed, singular, and is this my contribution to uplifting Africans? So good question, because I don't know how much most people are aware of how cannabis has been expressed to us all through the war on drugs and through criminalization of the plant, which is a natural plant, unlike alcohol, where most of the world consumes, even people whose religion says you should not consume it. And so we should talk about that just in the beginning to at least get a little bit of background as to my understanding of cannabis and how I came to be a cannabis advocate. So this has nothing to do with what's going on here on the continent of Africa, but it has a lot to do with my position and why I'm a cannabis advocate. So in 1999, in health class, we had to do, because it was in 1999, it was still kind of the end of the quote unquote war on drugs. It was still in the 90s. And we had to do these reports in health class about different kinds of drugs. And I remember doing a report on cannabis versus alcohol. And I was shocked to learn what I learned about the differences, right? At the time, there hadn't been much done in terms of studies for cannabis. So, later on, I learned a little bit more, but some of the effects of cannabis versus alcohol. So if somebody is against alcohol, then I also understand them being against cannabis as well, even though alcohol has far more detrimental effects on the body as cannabis, especially if you decide to consume cannabis through oral consumption, through eating it as opposed to smoking it. But just to be clear, some of the major differences are as follows. When it comes to alcohol, they do say between 8 and 9 out of 10 people abuse alcohol, meaning they have multiple drinks in a week, 3 to 4 to 5 drinks in a week or more. Most people have that in one sitting. Number one. Number two, the damages to your body, of course, in terms of alcohol consumption, right? Your liver, you might have seen young MA. Looks like she has some liver problems. There's a video recently of this recording artist from the United States, from New York, she's from Brooklyn. And people were concerned about her health and her well-being because her eyes were yellow. That's usually a sign of jaundice, which is usually a liver issue, which is generally caused by alcohol consumption. And so alcohol actually obviously has a disproportionately bad impact on the human body to its usage and its social importance, right? When you think about it, right? When people say, I don't want to pay for an expensive date, they'll say, can we go out for drinks? Or if it's after work, you're going after work, you're going out for drinks. You got happy hour after work, right? And so, there is a culture around alcohol that's been accepted because the prohibition of alcohol was lifted more than 100 years ago, right? So you had prohibition for, I think, 10 to 15 years or whatever it was. And that was lifted more than 100 years ago. So now, and it always has been part of the kind of everyday life. Alcohol was in the dark ages in Europe, they were drinking beer for breakfast. A lot of people will say their doctor told them they can drink wine while pregnant, right? And so there are many people who alcohol is, it's a part of their everyday life. When people say, I've had a stressful day, I need a drink, right? On TV shows, they'll have like a drink after work. And so, when it comes to cannabis, though, the studies show that something like 3% of cannabis, 30% of cannabis users are considered addicted to the substance, right? It's also, if used in its purest form, it's also grown directly out of the ground and has not been processed in any way. Now, of course, people do a lot of different things in terms of the germination and cultivation of cannabis plants. But the cannabis legalization or illegal nature of cannabis has a lot to do with why people look at cannabis the way they do. Rightly or wrongly, it is what it is, right? And so I think that this comment was well intentioned, but ill-informed, I will say. And so I think it's important to understand that although there hasn't been a more than 40 years of research on cannabis and how it impacts the human body, they do know that it does have medical benefits. They're still working through what that might look like across a number of different illnesses. But at this point in time, it's can't be disputed that of any of the substances, and you can include sugar, right? Like sugar, refined sugar, has a worse impact on the human body than cannabis does, right? You have an endocannabinoid system in your body. Now, everybody responds to cannabis differently, but you have an endocrine system, you have a respiratory system, you have a digestive system, you also have an endocannabinoid system in your body that can actually ingest cannabis. So there's still a lot of studies that need to be done, but I just want to make sure that everyone is aware that there's a lot more to cannabis than what you might think. And so that is why I want to talk about it on the continent of Africa, not just for recreational use, but for medical use, and why there are countries that are actually looking at the cultivation of cannabis. I'll also mention beyond that. So in my response to Ben, I wrote a couple of things. One, cannabis medical benefits far outweigh the current pharmaceutical painkillers and treatments that are on the market. So there are so many different painkillers and pharmaceutical drugs that you can get over the counter that have a long list of side effects, right? And if you ever hear a commercial on TV, in America, because they don't do commercials for pharmaceuticals many other places, especially not in Europe, but in America they do. And when they do, you'll notice at the very end, you have that person speaking really fast and really lowly, so you can hear all of the side effects. Sometimes it's death, kidney failure, thoughts of self-deletion. These are all parts of just over-the-counter medications, and then sometimes medications that doctors prescribe, right? So cannabis is can be considered a healthy alternative to some of those things. Okay, so that's one area. So we're just talking about in terms of the medical uses, which still has some work to do in terms of the study, but just keep that in mind. Two, also, it can be cultivated properly in terms of the hemp. So that's without the THC, the element that gives you what people consider a high, right? If you can cultivate it without the THC, which that can be done, and the hemp itself, that can be used as a replacement for paper, which means you can cut down less trees and you can produce 10 times more paper through hemp cultivation than through usage of large trees, right? And those trees can stay around to keep helping the planet breathe, right? Because trees ingest carbon dioxide, produce oxygen. We produce carbon dioxide and ingest oxygen, right? And so we have a symbiotic relationship with trees. It's ideal to keep trees alive on the planet, right? And then lastly, as I mentioned a little earlier, the recreational use of cannabis is far less destructive than what its counterpart, which is usually considered alcohol, right? Okay, so I wanted to get that out the way first because that was a pretty aggressive commentary, and I wanted to make sure I addressed that for you all here before we move on. Now, before I get into it, I saw a lot of comments as I was just running through what I just said, so let me just quickly address those. But in the meantime, if you're following on Instagram Live, head on over to the YouTube channel. The link is in my description on my Instagram page, and you can watch as I do the presentation live on YouTube, and you can follow along with the comments that are going to be on screen. It's tough to kind of follow along with the Instagram comments, especially when I'm presenting online. Okay, what do we have? Miss Shonda's here. Based Marie is from the Cayman Islands. Shout out to the Cayman Islands. Africa Revenge says weed can help. There are avenues for everyone. It's not like you're promoting sex or debauchery like the West does every single freaking day. Right. Okay. Freddie B thought the weeds plural. my listen, I'm just reading the comments. And Africa Revenge says weed is okay in moderation. And we'll talk a little bit about the size of the opportunity and the market here in just a moment. So let's get right to the presentation. I'm going to share my screen. So here we go. All right, cool. So again, we're going to just go through what I do in terms of my content. I do put up 2 to 3 videos per week, long form videos. That means videos that are at least 10 minutes or 15 minutes, interviews, vlogs, things of that nature. I also do short form content, clips from those interviews, and then just like really, really short shorts, 7 times a week. That's on YouTube. On Instagram, I'm posting 4 times a day. Everything happening on the continent and in the diaspora. So this is just a kind of a depiction of what kind of content you can expect to see from me. Make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe. If you know anybody who's looking to get into the cannabis industry or who is in the cannabis industry and want to know more about consumption on the continent, then this is something that you should share with them now or after the live is over. So as I mentioned, Authentic African is going to be live in the next 2 weeks. I am finalizing things right now to get this set up and live, and I will make it available to all of you as soon as it is. And we'll actually do a live where I review the site and everything pertaining to the site. I also am going to make sure that vendors can sell their products as well. We talked about this before, so I won't dwell on it. There will be an app for download for iOS and Android when the time comes. All right, so let's get into it. So here's kind of what we're going to talk about today in terms of cannabis on the continent of Africa. First, we're going to talk about the legal status of cannabis across Africa, number one. We're going to talk about key trends and opportunities. We're going to talk about the regional developments for cannabis in South Africa. I think it's called Lesotho, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Zambia, and believe it or not, Ghana, which is a country of interest. We're going to talk a little bit about Nigeria and Sierra Leone as well. Nigeria being the most densely populated country on the continent of Africa and has the highest consumption of cannabis. So of course we have to talk about them. And then of course we're going to talk about Sierra Leone because many of you are following this content because of Sierra Leone heritage and traveling to Sierra Leone. So we will talk about those 2 countries of interest and where they rank on the global stage in terms of usage of cannabis. So before we do that, I do want to get into the history and the current status of cannabis in Africa. But let me just make sure I'm not missing any questions or comments that have come up. Okay, so far so good. Nothing that I have missed so far. Okay, so here's the history of prohibition of cannabis. Now, what you're going to see here is on the right, I have a depiction of how the continent of Africa was split by the different European nations, right? And so you have some independent states in the early 1900s, which is one is Liberia, you see here, which it's already technically always been an independent state. And then you have Ethiopia, if I'm not mistaken. This is Ethiopia here. And that's it, right? Everyone else was colonized by one country or another. It was available for British residents only, though, for some reason in Ethiopia, which is interesting. Okay, so it became illegal at certain points in time. And you see it here, these dates, based on the colonial ruling of these countries. But let's talk about, like, just in general, cannabis and its history on the continent of Africa and kind of how we got to this point. So cannabis is actually not native to the continent of Africa. And it's actually not widely cultivated for commercial or recreational use on the continent. It is cultivated, but not widely, obviously, because it is technically illegal. Morocco, Lesotho, South Africa and Zimbabwe have a long history of cannabis cultivation, actually dating back to the colonial era when it was grown as a cash crop for export. So they were actually exporting it as a business at one point in time. The arrival of Europeans in Africa had a significant impact on the use of cannabis on the continent. Prior to colonialism, cannabis was widely used in Africa, and diverse cultures of cannabis use existed, including Central African practices that circulated widely in the Atlantic world via slave trading. The arrival of Europeans and anti-cannabis sentiments gained momentum, and of course, the plant was classified in the same class as cocaine, in some cases worse than cocaine. It's classified as the same as meth, methamphetamines, and other harsh drugs that are actually made in labs, which is interesting, right? You take a plant that grows as a flower, and you are now comparing that. Like in the United States, it's still federally a Schedule I substance. What else is Schedule I, you might ask? Heroin is a Schedule I substance. Cocaine is actually a Schedule II substance. And what does the scheduling mean? Just so you guys know, scheduling basically, when you schedule substances, the scheduling is based on its actual medical grade usage. What its use for, is it useful for medical usage? So the United States, when scheduling cannabis, they scheduled cannabis as a Schedule I substance with crack and with heroin, right? So those three are all scheduled together. Cocaine, which is another form of crack, is actually a Schedule II substance. And then Schedule III is like Tylenol and some of the other drugs that they use when you get put underneath when you are having surgery. Right. So basically, it's saying that Schedule II and Schedule I have no medical use whatsoever, even though certain things in Schedule II and Schedule I had been used as medication prior to the decision to make them all illegal. These are all scheduled the same. And so around the continent of Africa, they have similar scheduling, and that's what happened. So there was a 1925 Geneva Opium Convention that colonial power structure said suppressing marijuana cultivation and consumption among Africans, which you can see some of that on the right, where it was available for British residents only, but not for others. In certain places and areas, it was a free state, so you could. In South Africa, for instance, it was available for only for Indian laborers. Right. So there are certain groups that were allowed to, who weren't allowed to on the continent of Africa. It was prohibited widely, though, as a result of the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961. This was a United Nations treaty that was ratified by 40 countries, including colonial Africa, because at the time, it's not all, I think all countries on the continent of Africa were still under colonial rule at that time, which dictated global cannabis prohibition. So cannabis cultivation throughout Africa became a criminal enterprise, and weed was far from eradicated. So it did include cannabis and cannabis-related substances in its schedule. So Schedule I and Schedule IV. So cannabis and cannabis resin. So cannabis resin is a Schedule IV. Cannabis itself is a Schedule I. Schedule I extracts and tinctures of cannabis. The inclusion in a specific schedule determines the control measures the state parties must apply to that drug. Meaning, if it's a Schedule I, they should apply harsher, punishments for the usage of a Schedule I versus a Schedule II, quote unquote, narcotic. Are you guys following so far? Does history make sense? So I wanted to just give you guys a little bit of that background before we went any further. Any questions on any of that so far? Let me just make sure I'm checking to see if there's any questions. So this is a great question. The source for this actually was, there's a number of different sources. So, so actually let's go back to this. So Happy Guy is saying, where is your source for this? So which this Happy Guy, which in particular, because there are many sources that I'm using, and I'm more than happy. You guys see these numbers here? These numbers are all sourcing specific sources, and I'm happy to go through the sources at the very end. I walk through all the sources, but if you want to know the sources, actually, most of the sources are actually like the United Nations has done reports on cannabis consumption, and actually it's mostly from the United Nations, and so this mostly comes from them. So and they have been, for the most part, against consumption of cannabis. So I think it actually works as a good place to use in terms of understanding the numbers around cannabis consumption. Max, what's up, Max? Max and I used to work together. He said it's clear. Makes a lot of sense. Good. Okay, moving on. So I thought this was interesting, right? The number of annual cannabis consumers by country. Now, this is another source that I'll be referencing throughout, and this is the New Frontier data. There's a company called Cannabis, and they do surveys and or pull this data from other sources like the United Nations. And then where they just take it, synthesize it, and make it easy to look at and put it in graphical form for us. So this is 2019 data. It is a little bit old. They did not have 2022 data. Just know that these numbers are likely to grow because the populations in these countries have grown. These numbers are in millions of people. So if you're wondering how many people consume cannabis, in Nigeria, it's 20.8 million people as of 2019. Some of the other countries that you might find interesting here: Kenya is 3.3 million. Egypt and Ethiopia have really high consumption of cannabis, 7 million, 5 million respectively, or 5.9 and 7.1 million respectively. DRC has pretty large consumption of cannabis. Ghana has 2 million consumers of cannabis. Sierra Leone is not on this list because Sierra Leone only has 7 million people. So we'll get to a slide where we talk about the percentage of Sierra Leoneans consuming cannabis. But you can see that in terms of the market size, in Morocco, it's $3.5 billion market size right now. In Nigeria's, this is saying 15 billion. I think that number is closer to 20 billion now. Ethiopia was 9.8 billion at the time of this study. 83 million annual consumers of cannabis content wide on the continent of Africa. Out of the 1.3 billion people on the continent, 83 million annual consumers is the estimate of the number of consumers of cannabis on the continent of Africa. So welcome to those joining on Instagram. If you want to see the presentation and all the graphs and charts that I am presenting, you just want to click on the link in my profile. That'll take you to my YouTube channel. And then from there, you could just go find the live, the link to the live. Let's see if there are any other questions before I move on to the next slide. Happy Guy said, thanks for the response. No problem. I will definitely bring up the sources in a moment. All right, cool. So where is cannabis legal, right? So in different forms, cannabis is technically legal to some degree, and we'll talk about that, in 9 different countries out of the 54 countries on the continent of Africa. They say the total addressable market is 64 million. Now, see, this is the thing. Some people say 83 million. Some people say 64 million. These numbers are definitely going to be different because it's not like it's legal. So you're not going to be able to get everybody to say, yes, I consume cannabis. These are estimates based on, you know, criminal numbers of arrests and all seizures and all these kinds of things. And when I say seizures, I mean not physical seizures. I mean seizing of cannabis and money from people who are selling in the illicit markets. So the animal cannabis usage rates, they say on average is about 7.3%. And the illicit market value they're saying is about 29 billion. Again, different places have different numbers for this, but just know it is over a $25 billion illicit market on the continent of Africa. Okay, so here are some of the countries that have put some laws into place to decriminalize or legalize to some degree, and we'll talk about it. I will say, though, in particular, there are countries that have really harsh punishment for cannabis consumption that are actually going in the opposite direction. And I do want to call those out. So Eritrea, Ethiopia, which, by the way, is one of the countries that has pretty high consumption, Burundi, Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon all have strict laws against medical and recreational use of cannabis, which is interesting. Okay, so what do we have to look out for, right? What's the opportunity? What's happening right now? So the medical cannabis and industrial hemp industries have seen significant growth and development over the course of 2021 and 2022. Countries such as South Africa, Lesotho, Zimbabwe, Uganda, and Malawi have seen an increase in license, insurance, exports, and investments in the industry. South Africa in particular, which by the way, we're going to spend a little time on South Africa because they're the only ones who've actually fully legalized certain elements of cannabis consumption. So we'll go over that in a second. So South Africa has been a headline and a driver of growth, of course, and their president highlighted cannabis and hemp as being a priority for growth sectors in the South African economy in his State of the Nation address in February of 2022. He was stating that his goal of creating over 130,000 sustainable cannabis and industrial hemp jobs in South Africa. So the African cannabis industry as a whole is still small in size relative to other geographies like North America and South America. Europe, Israel, and Australia are also very high consumers of cannabis. But Africa currently has 11 countries that have some form of, I said 9 before, but 7 countries that have some form of legalized medical cannabis, whether that's for export only, whether that's for cultivation. It's very strange how you can have it for export only or for cultivation, but not for consumption. But that is it. So over the next 5 years, people are expecting that it's likely that the market for decriminalized cannabis will grow, obviously in South Africa and other places. And of course, that'll increase the need for supplies to bring in equipment to help cultivate it and develop a fully commercialized legal system if legislation continues to progress in South Africa, its neighboring countries, and other countries as well. So that is where we are today, and that is what is going on. So a little bit, and really quickly, I just want to show this. So the most used cannabis drug across Africa is marijuana, they say. Basically, it's the normal herb with the THC, and hashish, which is resin, which is very big in certain areas like Algeria. You can see it here. And then also here in South Africa. And then you can see, of course, cannabis itself, Senegal, Ivory Coast. And so this is the #1 consumption of the cannabis. And so this is a World Drug Report from the UN, one of the UN reports that they do. Anyway, so what do people call cannabis throughout Africa? I just thought this was interesting, so I'll mention it. So there are cannabis words that are derived in cognates from all different languages around the world, which I thought was interesting. And so some words come like, that are ja or jam, right? So which might remind you of what you hear when you hear maybe some Rastafarians speaking about cannabis, right? So you got Jamala in Madagascar, Jemu in Tanzania, and Jaya in Uganda, right? So there's different names that people call it, right? In Sierra Leone, we have Creole. It's called Jamba, right? In Sierra Leone, that's how people call it, right? Jamba in Sierra Leone. And you have Hindi cognates in other parts of Africa. And then you have other cannabis words which have the C, D, H, K, M, G, basically, but following similar terminologies in different regions. So I just thought it was interesting that there are different names for the same substance across the continent because of different trade routes and trade partnerships throughout the years. All right, before we get into the target regions for cannabis cultivation, let me at least get back to see if there's any questions or comments. Jerry Campbell is checking in from New York. What's up, Jerry? Thanks for joining. And we have Troy is a lying. Okay, Troy. He said DARE. I can't remember what the acronym DARE stood for, but DARE was one of those things that we definitely, when I was in middle school, we had to do reports on alcohol and drugs, and DARE was one of the things that we always had these posters all around school for DARE because of the war on drugs. All right, cool. So I think this map is interesting because it shows that sub-Saharan Africa contains 200 million hectares of uncultivated land, nearly half of the world's supply. So that means there is so much opportunity for agriculture and the growth of cannabis. And it also is the perfect environment for the growth of cannabis because of its closeness to the equator, its fertile soil, right? So the ability to cultivate and grow cannabis is huge. And so some target regions for cannabis cultivation you can see here. And you can see that it includes some areas where cannabis has already been legalized. There's some regions here in where the crop yields are below their potential, but could. In West Africa, specifically in Sierra Leone is called out. Guinea is also being called out here. Senegal gets called out here. Mali, Burkina Faso, or Burkina Faso, excuse me. And then, of course, in East Africa, you see Uganda, Somalia, Ethiopia are all, and even a little bit in Kenya here too. So you can see there are many countries across the continent where cannabis can be cultivated, and most people think it should be cultivated. Jaya is asking what the name of cannabis in Uganda is. So in Uganda, it's called Njaya. You like that because your name is Jaya. Yes. Jaya, you're hilarious. So yeah, this Njaya. All right, cool. So let's get to the legalization. So where is it legal? Where is it illegal? And let's get into country deep dive. So we can talk about specific countries. There's some countries of interest, which I consider them countries of interest because they have high cannabis usage, but it's illegal. And then there are other countries where there are high cannabis usage or just usage in general, and it's legal. Oh, and Miss P was helping me out here with the definition for DARE. Remember DARE? It is drug abuse resistance education. So there you go. All right, so let's talk about legalization, where it's legal, who's legalized it, what's legal, when was it legalized, why, and how. So let's get into it. So this is interesting. And I was shocked when I saw some of these numbers. And I think I want to spend some time here because this really caught me off guard. So if you're looking at this graph to the right, this is from the Prohibition Partners and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, right? So the United Nations has done this study, and this is what they did. And Great Britain Beats actually mentioned the documentary that Vice did about a strain of cannabis found in Africa. I actually don't think that that's a strain of cannabis. I think that's a mix with other things. But maybe I need to watch that documentary. But there was a documentary I saw portions of about what they're calling Kush, but that's a different topic, and we'll talk about that later. But that is not technically cannabis. I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to, but that is something else that people are mixing with cannabis that is actually killing people. So I'm not going to speak to that in particular because that is not cannabis. But I do want to speak about this. So people are wondering, right, cannabis consumption on the continent of Africa. So I thought this was interesting. 5 of the world's biggest cannabis using countries for the ages of 15 to 64 are located in Africa. There are 206 countries that generally the world recognizes as countries. And it's between 200 and 206 or 210. Some countries consider themselves independent. Their neighboring countries say, you're not independent, you're part of us. So, but the number is between 200 and 210 countries in the world. And 5 of the top consumers are on the continent of Africa. And so we're going to talk about not only the number that they're ranked, some of these countries, but the number of users in those countries. So Nigeria, the number is going to vary between slides because different reports have different numbers and different years. This particular report speaks to the fact that Nigeria is ranked 3rd in the world in terms of the amount of cannabis consumers in the country. Now, Nigeria does have a little over 220 million people in the country. It says 14.9 million of those are cannabis users, and that's 14% of the population. Zambia is ranked 10th with 880,000 users. That's 9% of the population. Madagascar is ranked 14th, 1.3 million users in Madagascar. That's 9.1% of the population. Egypt is ranked 25th with 3.8 million users and 6.4% of the population. That's a lot of people, right, consuming cannabis. Now, Sierra Leone. Now, in terms of the population, Sierra Leone is closer to one of the smallest, least populated countries in the world. But in terms of its rank of usage, it's pretty high with 222,000 users of cannabis. It's ranked 30th in the world, and that's 5.2% of the population of Sierra Leone consumes cannabis. I thought this was really interesting. I wanted to share it with you all because I was shocked how much consumption of cannabis happens on the continent of Africa, where it is mostly illegal. However, apparently it is also a transportation route to many other parts of the world. So that was interesting. All right, let's see if there's any other questions or comments before we move on. So Jaya is talking about Kush in Sierra Leone is equivalent to the K2 in America that had folks going crazy. It's completely synthetic. So yeah, that's what we're talking about. Where there was a documentary that Vice did about what they're calling Kush, but it's really it's like K2. It is not the Kush which was named after the Kush Empire, which is a strand of cannabis. It is not that. It's something different. When they're calling it Kush in Sierra Leone, it's something different, and it's killing people. I want to give a quick shout out to Guillermo Williams. Salute, cuz, for the pot. I really do appreciate you supporting the channel with the financial support. Every little bit helps, so I thank you. The question is, who was first again? So in terms of the countries of consumption where cannabis is number one, I would imagine that's the United States, right? Because it has, but I actually don't know the actual. I actually don't know who's the largest consumers. It may be India, because India has almost 1 billion people. So it may be India. I'll have to check that. I've only been looking at the continent of Africa, to be honest. Proman J says that's very. Oh, Miss P says that's very interesting. Yeah, it's these numbers were shocking to me. I was not prepared for those numbers. So I'm glad you guys are finding this useful and interesting. All right. So let's move on. So let's start with Nigeria, because Nigeria has the highest GDP on the continent of Africa, is the most densely populated country in the continent of Africa, and it's called the African Giant, right? So let's talk about it. It is illegal, medically and recreationally. Both cannabis, recreational, and medical usage are illegal. But in 2019, there was a provincial governor who disclosed plans by the country to grow cannabis for medicinal and industrial purposes. We'll see if that happens. If in fact it was legalized, 10% of the Africa cannabis industry. So they say the cannabis industry in Africa is about $37 billion currently. If Nigeria was to legalize cannabis, or the size of the market today is $3.7 billion by the end of 2023, if it was legalized by this most populous country. Can you imagine the amount of revenue that can be generated by a crop that is grown? And I'd like to think that with this crop, as a continent, we would do a better job of preserving the wealth within our own countries, because we hadn't done so well with that with other crops previously, right? But this is interesting, right? And think about this. In the United States, when cannabis was illegal, there was a lot of talk about this cannabis came from Canada, because Canada had some different kinds of cultivation. and it was like Canadian strands of cannabis. And then you had cannabis from California, right? People would call this stuff Cali Kush, and the weed from California is the best weed. And it's because cannabis in California had been medically legalized since the mid 90s, right? And so the ability to cultivate and grow and germinate and do all these different things with cannabis really led to the progression of cannabis and its, let's say, its potency and its the multiple different strains that were available, right? Imagine the continent of Africa being able to brand and cultivate cannabis and distribute it globally as if it was legal. Imagine what that could do for the continent of Africa with the vast amount of land that is ripe for growing cannabis. So that, to me, I think is a huge opportunity. And we'll talk a little bit more about the opportunity in terms of the size and the numbers in a moment. But I just wanted to mention that. Next, let's talk about Sierra Leone. This is my parents' country of origin. This is, of course, where I have dual citizenship with the United States and Sierra Leone. And let's talk about cannabis in Sierra Leone. So although Sierra Leone was number 30 in terms of the number of countries, or in terms of the countries that consume cannabis, it is illegal. It's known as Jamba. And so some people spell it Jamba, some people spell it Diamba. Depends on how it's always pronounced the same. It's pronounced like Jamba, but you can pronounce Diamba like Jamba, right? Is illegal for both medicinal and recreational purposes in Sierra Leone. As I mentioned before, the country remains a major cannabis cultivation area and transit point for smuggling to Europe. It just is what it is. This is from the Canigma. That is a website that basically has been pulling this data in from the WHO, from the UN, from all these different places, and making it available to follow and making it easy to understand where it's legal. Next, you have Egypt. Egypt was also a big consumer of cannabis, and it's illegal recreational and medically. It has a widespread culture of cannabis consumption, especially hashish. In 2018, the deputy governor of Cairo proposed a law to decriminalize cannabis, but it did not result in any changes to the status of cannabis in the country. The country also has a long history of medical cannabis use, including all the way back to ancient Kemet, which is, we're calling it Egypt now, but back then it was called Kemet. And back then they were using cannabis for medical usage. And so it has been a part of Egyptian culture for thousands of years. We're talking 10,000 years. So Kenya is also a large consumer of cannabis, but is also illegal medically and recreationally. The Narcotics, Drugs, and Psychotropic Substance Control Act of 1994 was passed. And there have been campaigns in recent years to legalize cannabis, including on the part of Rastafarian community, as well as some lawmakers, including one who introduced draft legislation to legalize cannabis in 2018. Unfortunately, that was not passed, but they are still working on trying to legalize it. So I just wanted to call out the countries where consumption is large, but it's also illegal. So you guys just get an understanding of where they are right now, what the status is in those countries. So you don't have to keep asking me anymore, or if you know anybody who wants to know, they can reference this until some updates, and then we'll do an update. But until then, they can always reference this live to know what is available, where it's legal, and where it's not. Okay. So William Thompson says, in Africa, we used to consume it, but when former colonial powers said it was bad, then we start looking at it negatively. That is correct, right? That is why cannabis consumption has been deemed as illegal. And I already mentioned the law that was passed in 1961. Okay, moving on. So where is it legal, right? And how is it legal? I want to get into that because I want to explain what it means to be legal for cannabis consumption and cultivation on the continent of Africa, because it does not look like how it looks in the United States, for instance, or in Canada, where you have pretty straightforward laws in certain states, right? There are countries on the continent of Africa that have very nuanced laws. And so I want to go through some of these and do kind of a deep dive. So, interestingly enough, I'm starting with Ghana, not the biggest, not even the most lax laws, but because I live in Ghana, I just thought it would be interesting to start with this one. So, medical cannabis is illegal. However, hemp is legal for medical and industrial use. So that's extracting the psychoactive element of THC out of cannabis, and hemp is available for use for industrial use and medical use. That is important because hemp really is a better alternative to plastics, to papers, to cardboard, and many other things that is used by the paper industry. So medical and recreational cannabis are illegal in Ghana, but since the passing of the Narcotics Control Commission bill in 2020, the state favors alternatives to incarceration for drug offenses like possession of marijuana, which is now viewed more as a public health issue. The law also legalized cultivation of hemp, medical, and industrial uses. So in Ghana, there are checkpoints for police, and sometimes they'll pull people over. And I've heard stories of people having cannabis in their bags. And what they'll do is they'll tell you that they can take you down and they'll arrest you, but it's actually been there are alternatives for incarceration. So what they're doing in general is doing a shakedown and basically asking for a bribe, right? And so what usually happens is because most people don't know that it's incarceration is not really usually the process for people who consume cannabis in Ghana. What ends up happening is you are asked to just pay a bribe and they'll let you go. So here's what it is in South Africa. Now there's 3 slides on South Africa because I think it's important to do a deep dive on South Africa in particular because of what they've done. So they've medically legalized cannabis and then they decriminalized the recreational use, right? So in 2018, a ruling by South Africa's Constitutional Court said it is legal for adults to grow and smoke smoke cannabis in the privacy of their home. The state allows presiding physicians to prescribe medical cannabis products for any health condition and does not have a set list of health conditions. So they can decide whatever health condition you have, they can prescribe cannabis to you. There's no specific set list. So whereas you might think in certain states, like in New York in 2014, they legalized the medical consumption. And I remember when they did that, one of the things that went along with it was you had to have one of 5 terminal illnesses in order for it to be prescribed. In Los Angeles, when cannabis was medically legalized, right, we had this, we had what they called a referral. They couldn't prescribe it because in the United States, it's a federally controlled substance under Schedule 1, which Schedule 1 says that it has no medical benefits. So if it's federally saying it's no medical benefits, then a doctor can't prescribe it to you. They can recommend it. So in California and most states who have it legalized for medical use, it's a recommendation, not a prescription because of the way it's described. But in South Africa, as you can see, it has been decriminalized recreationally and has been made available for legal use. Now, I will say that'll be why you'll see the neighboring countries have started to decriminalize or legalize the exports and the cultivation of cannabis to South Africa, because of course, if that country has legalized it, then there obviously is a market of consumers. So here's a deeper dive. So cannabis is listed as a Schedule 7 substance, which still says no legitimate medicinal use in South Africa, but cannabidiol, I always mess it up, CBD, is listed as a Schedule 4 substance, which is legal if prescribed by a physician. So CBD has the THC extracted from it, or it can have small traces of THC, but not enough for the high that people are used to. To date, there are no registered cannabis-containing medicines in South Africa, but medical cannabis products can be prescribed for any health condition as long as the presiding physician determines it could be helpful could help for in treatment. So next, globally, the cannabis and hemp market is thriving. African countries are significant contributors to the supply chain. According to the African Cannabis Report, global sales of cannabis-related products and cannabis could reach a total of 102 billion by 2026. Now, South Africa is still in the early stages of overcoming its various legal, political, and social obstacles it takes to become a major player in the industry, but its favorable climate, loosening laws, viable farming land, and pre-existing experience in agriculture and hemp production makes it a promising contender on the world stage. The medical cannabis market is particularly promising because nations around the world are beginning to legalize its use for conditions such as Alzheimer's and chronic pain. Germany recently became the largest and most developed market, with other European countries steadily allowing for its use to treat medical conditions. These countries have been turning to South African producers to source medical cannabis products because these most often meet the strict regulatory requirements imposed by foreign governments. So South Africa is really poised to benefit greatly from loosening laws around the world, especially in Europe. And it's called out here specifically talking about Germany. So I wanted to spend some time on South Africa. Let's talk about some others. So Happy Guy says they make a mistake of just promoting CBD, as THC is known to kill cancer. That is what I'm reading from Happy Guy. I will say there are studies ongoing about medical benefits, including its use for being able to fight cancer. It has not been widely agreed upon yet in many medical journals, but there are a larger contingent of physicians and peer-reviewed studies that are showing the benefits of cannabis for terminal illnesses such as cancer from time to time. But today, it is not widely agreed upon in the medical community as of yet. William Thompson says it could become a good source of export revenue for West African countries. Absolutely. And I'd love to see that. And fingers crossed it gets there. And not just for like personal consumption for myself, but really for the ability for African nations to generate more revenue from their crops. You know, this is something that could be huge. And like I said, there's just so much unused land that is ripe for cultivation. And I think it'd be perfect to see that happen here. Okay. So now let's get into some of the other countries. So now, Lesotho is a country where I am not that familiar with, but it is smack in the middle of South Africa, surrounded on all sides by South Africa. But it is still recreationally, but it is legal medically. So in 2017, they became the first African country to legalize cultivation of cannabis for medical purposes. Then, of course, South Africa followed after, surrounding the country. So the country also has legalized and manufactured, distribution, import, and export of cannabis. And the industry is expected to be a major boom for one of the world's poorest countries, right? In April 2021, the country became the first in Africa to be granted an EU license to sell medical cannabis to the EU. The country still does not have domestic medical cannabis program, and recreational cannabis still remains illegal in the country. But this could be huge for them. They obviously still have to develop it. And as we develop it, obviously, and the countries work together, you can start to see that countries like Lesotho could be one to really gain from its legalization. Zimbabwe has legalized it medically. It's still illegal recreationally. And you can see it does border South Africa. And so it makes sense for them to legalize it medically. In 2018, Zimbabwe became the second African country, so they actually did before South Africa, to legalize marijuana cultivation for medical and scientific purposes. In 2019, the country approved its first commercial cultivation permit. So let's move on to Malawi. So Malawi has decriminalized it medically, and it's still illegal recreationally in 2020. And so Malawi, by the way, is not too far from Zimbabwe. And so it's about 2 countries over, as you can see here. And it passed the bill decriminalizing cannabis for medical and industrial use. The move came 5 years after the country passed legislation legalizing the cultivation of industrial hemp. So if Ghana's anything like what you see with Malawi, Malawi first did industrialized hemp 5 years ago. Industrialized hemp in 2015. In 2020, they decriminalized it. And so if in just was it 2 years ago, Ghana made industrialized hemp available. So maybe within the next few years, cannabis will be decriminalized and potentially legalized in Ghana. Malawi is also home to Malawi Gold, one of the world's most legendary Landrace strains, though recreational cannabis remains illegal in the country. So Malawi Gold is somehow has been exported and is one of the more popular strands of cannabis, or I don't know what Landrace is. Sorry, I didn't get that, but it's still illegal for recreational use within the country. All right, so Rwanda, not too far off, a bit north, and it is legal medically, illegal recreationally. So Rwanda passed a new order to legalize medical use in 2021, and it established regulation for growing, processing, exporting, and medical usage, as well as research on cannabis itself. So the country has not legalized recreational cannabis, of course, and it retains harsh penalties actually for offenders on recreational use, which is interesting. Morocco, Casablanca, one of the places people like to go. Marrakesh is also in Morocco. So two places that if you see people talking about Marrakesh or Casablanca, that's what they're talking about. And it is legal to cultivate. It is illegal for recreational use. So this has long been one of the world's biggest producers of illicit cannabis in the form of hashish. So in May of 2021, Morocco voted to legalize the cultivation of cannabis for medical and industrial purposes. The country was named by the UNDOC in 2016 as the world's largest producer of cannabis resin, and it is not legalized recreational cannabis, and there's no domestic medical marijuana program in the country, although it is legal to cultivate medically. So Uganda, now we're getting back to East Africa. So we're looking at Uganda, and it is illegal for medical and recreational use. However, cannabis is illegal for recreational and medical purposes in Uganda, though the country in 2020 issued guidelines for companies or individuals looking to grow cannabis for export purposes. So basically, if you want to export to any of the southern countries who are making it legal for medical usage. In 2021, the country began allowing cannabis cultivation for export. Zambia, we're going back down to Southern Africa, again, neighboring some of the countries that we've already talked about where it was legal. It is illegal for medical and recreational use. However, cannabis is legal for it's illegal for recreational use in Zambia. Though in 2021, the cabinet approved a bill to legalize cannabis for medicinal and research purposes. That move follows a decision by the country in 2019 to approve cannabis exports. So under the country's Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substance Act, CAP 96, you can see that there are some similar names in different countries for how they've named this. The cultivation of cannabis is legal if the plant is cultivated for purposes of medicine or is not on a substantial and commercial scale. So that means a small amount for medical use, basically. All right. So let's talk about the market size. What would happen if it was legal all over the continent of Africa? So here's some of the benefits of legalization as we get into it. So first of all, legalizing cannabis in Africa has the potential to provide new sources of taxable revenue for countries seeking to recover financially in the aftermath, of course, of the pandemic, of the global sickness. The cannabis industry could create jobs and boost tax revenue, of course, as I mentioned. It could provide an opportunity for small farmers to participate in the legal cannabis market in a more equitable and sustainable direction, and give them more crops to grow, right? And people who have a ton of land and can't build on it would be able to grow on it, right? Additionally, Africa has warm weather, rich soil, and abundant sunshine necessary to grow high-quality cannabis in open fields, which could place the continent in a prime position to benefit from the booming legal cannabis market. Now, let's be clear. Just think about where Africa is. It's centrally located. It's already seen as a place for China, Russia, the United States, Europe, India, Lebanon, right, to do business. So now, and part of it is because of its central location. Now, in terms of agriculture, it's also been big on exports, cocoa and other exports, sugarcane, etc. So now imagine you can add cannabis to that list, right? And it now becomes, by far, would be the largest exporter by far as a continent of cannabis, and it would make the most revenue as a continent. So the cannabis market in Africa is estimated to be worth $37.3 billion, making up 11% of the global market value of illicit cannabis. As I mentioned before, Nigeria has the highest rate of cannabis use, with an annual market value of, see, it goes back and forth, 3 billion to 15.3 billion. According to a report from New Frontier Data, out of the 263 million annual consumers of cannabis worldwide, 83 million of them, representing 32%, live in Africa. In 2018, Africa accounted for approximately 11%, and I said that already. And cannabis remains the most widely used illicit substance in the African region, with the highest prevalence and increase in use being reported in West and Central Africa, with rates between 5.2 and 13.5% usage in their country, in their regions, respectively. So what's there to look forward to, right? The cannabis industry in Africa is poised for growth, and there are opportunities for investment in this sector. According to a recent African Hemp and Cannabis report, obviously the demand is 37 billion, which I mentioned. Obviously, Nigeria has the highest rate, 11% of the world's value. And so obviously, South Africa has proposed a master plan. So that's all reasons to invest when the time comes. So some key findings and final thoughts. So, you know, the African medicinal cannabis and industrial hemp industries have seen significant growth in the countries that we've mentioned, right? South Africa's obviously been a headline driver. Africa obviously has a favorable growing climate, competitive cultivation input cost, and a rich history of traditional cannabis growing communities all over the continent of Africa, which is similar to what you see in South America. Medical cannabis and industrial hemp continue to be key focal industries for revived growth. And of course, due to South Africa having a mature over-the-counter CBD market since 2019, South Africa is the largest domestic market in Africa by market value. So a lot to consider there in terms of, you know, what are the key findings, right? And then lastly, unlike other legal cannabis jurisdictions, Africa has very few registered medical cannabis patients. South Africa is the largest patient market, estimated to have less than 1,000 registered patients. Africa currently has 11 countries that have done some form of legalization. As I mentioned, I've gone through all of them. It's driven by exports, of course, the cannabis industry. The total estimated size of the legal cannabis market is approximately somewhere between 37 and 41 billion, with the bulk legal sales occurring in the CBD market. The industrial hemp sector in Africa is still in its infancy with limited traction, and over the next 5 years, it's likely for the market to see decriminalization and increased growth. So there was a lot there. I wanted to get through that quickly. It was a lot of slides. I think it was 40-something slides, but I wanted to ensure that I went through all of that for you guys. So to answer your question, so if you guys know anybody looking to get in the cannabis industry on the continent of Africa, who's thinking about investing, wants to know where it's legal, how it's legal, all of those answers, I hope, all those questions, I hope, were answered today. Are there any other questions, comments, thoughts before we draw this live to a close. And I'll give you guys a second to come up with your questions if there are any. I want to first of all thank everyone who's been supporting for so long. And again, I want to shout out Guillermo Williams, who got 5 on it, as they say. So thank you, Guillermo. I appreciate it. Anybody else? Comments, questions, concerns, thoughts before we draw this thing to a close? Okay, one other thing that I'll mention in terms of cannabis consumption and usage. You know, like anything else, once it starts getting rolled out, it will take some time for it to gain traction. But again, as I've always said about the continent of Africa, everything in Africa right now is on the ground floor, except for like natural resource mining, like diamonds and cobalt and things like that. Those industries have long gotten their players that are in that space, multiple generations, hundreds of years of generations of people cultivating those natural resources. Getting into those markets are very difficult as a new entrant. But there are many other industries that are coming down the pipe in terms of startups, in terms and like technology, but then also cannabis, right? So we've talked about startups on the continent of Africa and the investments. Now we have the burgeoning market of cannabis and the cannabis industry. And so it's definitely the time to get into the cannabis industry. Of course, you would have to do it in the Southern African countries because that's where it's actually more recently been legalized. And there are things in place for the export to the European Union and in particular even Germany as well. So there are a couple questions. Happy Guy says, which country do you think will legalize recreationally first? And do you think it will take the West to do it for Africa to follow? Great questions. Number one, I do think the first country will be South Africa for sure, because they're already in the process, right? And do I think it's going to happen in the West first? Yes. The West is the reason why Africa criminalized it in the first place. I think the West is going to have to be the reason for Africa decriminalizing and legalizing it for sure. I definitely think Africa will follow suit. It just is the way of the world as it is today. Pro Woman J said, seen anybody smoking weed anywhere you've been in Africa? Yes. Yes. In fact, every country I've been to in Africa, I have witnessed cannabis consumption. I've been to Egypt, Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and in each of those countries, Egypt, Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, yeah, those 4 countries, I have witnessed cannabis consumption for sure. Absolutely. Ms. P says, this was very informative. Thank you, Joe. You're welcome. I'm glad you found it informative. Make sure you share this with anybody who's a big cannabis fan. Some of our earlier watchers of the live used to always ask about cannabis. They haven't been on in a while, but there were some groups that used to come on board and ask all the time. So those of you who are in the comments, who are familiar with some of those folks, share this live with them so they can get their questions answered, because part of doing this was to help answer those questions for them. All right, guys. With that, I'm going to bring this thing to a close. I want to thank you all for joining. If you are watching this on a replay, make sure you just comment in the comments below. I'll get back to your comments if you have any other questions. If you have any questions that I don't get to after I close out this broadcast, feel free to put it in the comments in the replay, and we'll definitely answer those questions. With that, guys, I want to say thanks once again for all of the support. Thanks for watching. If you like this content, please hit that thumbs up button. Hit that notification bell and subscribe if you haven't subscribed. And share this with at least 3 people you know who are thinking about moving or visiting the continent. And with that, guys, thanks for watching. See you all on the next video.